Excellences, Monsieur le Directeur Général, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants, c'est un grand plaisir que de vous accueillir pour cette leçon d'ouverture de l'année académique 2015-2016. Comme chaque début de cycle universitaire, ce moment est un moment de séparation et un moment d'accueil. De séparation, puisque une cohorte d'étudiants nous quitte, et vient de nous quitter. À peu près 300 étudiants ont reçu leur diplôme de master et de doctorat, et il y a 2 semaines. 2 professeurs nous quittent également en cet automne. Le professeur Nicolas Michel, professeur de droit international bien connu, qui était partagé avec l'Université de Genève, où il était professeur ordinaire et professeur associé ici, ainsi que le professeur Bruno Archidiacono, historien, qui a joué un rôle considérable dans la vie de cette maison, notamment dans la dernière décennie comme directeur des études. Moment d'accueil, puisque en cet automne 2015, à peu près 330 étudiants nous ont rejoints, à qui je souhaite la bienvenue et à qui j'adresse mes meilleurs vœux pour que leur séjour dans cette maison soit mémorable et leur permette de faire des amis pour la vie et d'acquérir des connaissances et aussi une expérience qui leur seront utiles tout au long non seulement de leur carrière professionnelle mais de leur vie personnelle. Accueil également à des professeurs qui nous rejoignent. Cette année, nous avons nommé 13 nouveaux professeurs, dont la plupart nous rejoignent cette année, d'autres en début d'année prochaine, d'autres encore en automne prochain. Et sur ces 13 professeurs, 9 sont des femmes, et nous sommes particulièrement heureux de pouvoir ainsi contribuer à rétablir un déséquilibre qui devient proprement scandaleux avec le temps qui passe entre un public d'étudiants à majorité féminine et un corps de professeurs qui reste tristement masculin. Cette soirée nous donne le grand privilège et le grand plaisir d'accueillir le directeur général de l'OMC, M. Roberto Azevêdo, à qui je vais passer la parole immédiatement, qui devra nous quitter à 19h30 et qui a accepté, après avoir prononcé son allocution, de prendre quelques questions. Je crois qu'il n'est pas besoin de présenter longuement M. Azevêdo, qui connaît la Genève internationale comme nul autre, probablement, dans cette salle. Au terme, si j'ose dire, le terme n'est pas encore venu, mais en tout cas, après une carrière très distinguée d'ambassadeur, qui l'a amené à exercer ses fonctions à Genève avant de devenir directeur général de l'OMC, où il a tout de suite pris ses marques et montré ses talents de négociateur et de constructeur de consensus, comme se plaisent à le dire beaucoup de ses collègues. Et c'est donc une grande joie que de vous accueillir ce soir, directeur général. Merci.
Well, Director Durand, graduates, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly pleased to be here with you today as you begin this new academic year. And it's a great pleasure to join you here in your new building, the Maison de la Paix. And it is actually a very appropriate name. It was the poet Archibald MacLeish who first wrote the words, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that we must start the construction of the defenses of peace. And education, I think, is the best hope that we have for building a better and more prosperous and peaceful world. So, as leaders of the future, I trust that you will use your time here in this institution well. And you couldn't be in a better place. While you study world affairs, you will have as your neighbors not only the World Trade Organization, but also the United Nations, the UNHCR, the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, and many others besides. So we're not just neighbors in a physical sense, although we are, but I think that the Geneva community of international organizations, academia, NGOs, students, academics, they are united by common values, particularly the vision of a constructive cooperation on global issues. And I want to talk to you about this evening precisely about the WTO's contribution to this vision. So it will be a general overview, more of a strategic approach. So don't expect me to be talking about the details of the negotiations in the WTO. You'd be asleep in 10 minutes. So, but if you want to get into that during the question and answers, I'm more than happy to answer. So the WTO is a relative newcomer in the international scene. This year we are marking our 20th anniversary, so we might be actually younger than most of you, many of you. 128 governments came together to create this organization in 1995, and in their ministerial declaration, they predicted that this organization would usher in a new era of global economic cooperation. So has that prediction or that ambition proved accurate? And over these 2 decades, I think the organization has certainly faced major challenges. Our negotiating arm, especially the Doha Development Round, has made slow progress. A growing number of trade conflicts is putting real pressure on our dispute settlement mechanism. The expansion of the regional trade agreements, some of them among major trading blocs. With that event, many have questioned whether or not they could actually replace the WTO. And of course, the WTO has been the focus of some discontent. Sometimes in the public opinion, we've seen some anti-globalization protests. Well, I was in Seattle in 1999, so you all know about that. But these challenges should not be underestimated, nor should they be downplayed. But shortcomings, I think that as I have outlined, or at least they look like shortcomings, because frankly, most of them are the result, thank you so very much, of the achievements of the WTO. And despite these challenges, I would argue that the open, transparent, and rules-based trading system that we have as embodied in the WTO has become an essential pillar of global governance, certainly global economic governance. Sorry, I've been speaking too much today. People don't listen. In fact, I think that a sound example of the principles of international cooperation and integration are in action in the WTO. And to appreciate this, I think it is important to look at the origins of the system. So I beg your indulgence to go back a few years to the years following the Second World War. And at that juncture, economic cooperation was seen as a ways of building peace and prosperity, and avoiding, of course, the threat of protectionism, which had, if you recall, sown the seeds of depression and the conflicts in the 1930s. So the Bretton Woods Conference at that time sought to give this vision an institutional footing, with rules and structures and creating the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, as you know, and the World Bank. But they also felt at that time the need for a similar institution for trade, which would complement the work of the IMF and the World Bank. But the plans that they had for an international trade organization were unsuccessful. Instead, a group of nations signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which of course fell short of that original vision of an international institution. And the GATT was not a fully fledged institution, organization. The membership was very limited, and the scope of its mandate was also very limited. Over time, as the issues that they were discussing in the GATT broadened, and as more nations joined in, the limitations of the GATT became evident, and the need for a more permanent structure with a wider scope and an effective dispute settlement mechanism was clear. And so the WTO was created in 1995. And it was given the same legal and organizational standing as all the other international organizations, and oversaw new and expanded agreements on trades in goods, in services, and in intellectual property. And with this structure, trade relations were put on a more secure foundation. So as I see it, by founding the WTO and agreeing on the legal text, our members of the WTO provided the equivalent of what I would say a constitution for world trade. And that constitution enshrines the basic, perennial principles of trade. Non-discrimination, for example, is one of them, and it is embodied in two very important premises. The first one, that most favored nation treatment, is there, which prohibits a member from discriminating between trade partners by offering more favorable treatment to one to the detriment of another. So that is one basic principle of non-discrimination. Another one is national treatment. So it's not between members. This one prohibits discrimination between foreign goods and domestic produced goods, requiring that similar goods, or like we call in the WTO, like goods, be treated the same way. Once they have crossed the border and paid all the duties and everything, they are treated equally. And the principles that underline the WTO, like these, they inform pretty much all of the agreements that we have in place today. So this legal framework was very important, but I think that the creation of the organization had an even wider significance. Because if the general agreement on tariffs and trade was the product of a divided world, the WTO was the symbol of a more unified one. The GATT started with just 23 members in 1947, and they were largely developed countries. Today, the WTO has 161 members, and they incorporate economies pretty much of every stripe, encompassing 98% of global trade. So since the WTO was created in 1995, we have welcomed 33 new members, ranging from giants like Russia, China, all the way to small island states like Vanuatu, the Seychelles, Cape Verde. And I think that this is the clearest sign that a new era has been created by the WTO. And the idea of 161 nations, including major economies, East and West and North and South, cooperating on trade issues under a system that has shared rules that are subject to a common dispute settlement system, it would have seemed far-fetched just a few decades ago. But now it is a reality. And the diversity of the organization is reflected in what we do on our day-to-day work. Unlike the GATT and in some other international bodies, decision-making is not in the hands of a few. It is all of them taken by consensus. So every single member has to be on board if we are to agree on anything. Developing countries play an increasingly important role in decision-making and also in setting the agenda. And the integration of the developing world into an open trading system has also been accompanied by their growing share in world trade. So developing countries' share in global merchandise trade has increased from 27% in 1995, when the WTO was created, to over 43% today. And the WTO also provides practical support for countries to start trading through a range of initiatives that build capacity and that build trading skills. So special focus is placed on the needs of the most fragile, the most vulnerable countries, so we're trying to help that. The least developed countries will benefit from a number of provisions in the WTO that help them integrate more and to benefit from global trade. And we're looking to do more. I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me just say that there is significant, great value in the system as it exists today. It is no coincidence that as the rule of law in trade has spread, the average tariffs have fallen dramatically. So in 1995, the average tariff was around 15%. Today, they stand at less than 8%. So trade volumes have also doubled during this period. And this is supported, all this, by the day-to-day work of the WTO. And this work goes often unseen. But nonetheless, I think that it is precisely this work, the day-to-day work that we do there, that holds the system up. We provide a forum for policy dialogue and information sharing. And there, members can monitor each other's practices and regulations to ensure that the agreements are being observed. I often hear or read in the press saying the WTO said this or the WTO said that, confirmed this, confirmed that. The WTO doesn't think, the WTO doesn't say anything. It is the members who do the talking. It is the members who do the observing and the monitoring between each other. So it is an everyday work that has extraordinary results. It was precisely this process of monitoring trade policies that was pivotal in ensuring that after the financial crisis in 2008, we didn't see the kind of rampant protectionism that we experienced in the 30s. The regular work of the WTO committees is also very important in enabling countries to exchange information and to raise concerns and suggest new approaches. So all of this sounds very technical, but these committees deal with real-life issues. For example, in standards and regulations, like chemicals in toys, or toxins in food, or caffeine labeling on energy drinks, limits on alcohol in spirits. So it's things that you deal with on your day-to-day lives. You just don't know that we're talking about these things in the WTO. Lucky you. They provide this work, these committees, a platform then for members to discuss all these matters and the regulations involved. It is also a very important avenue for technical exchange. So not only do they discuss the issues, they also exchange ideas, and therefore they promote confidence. It preempts unnecessary friction, and it is, I think, a very useful mechanism for members. And this is attested, I think, by the hundreds of matters that have been brought before these committees over the lifetime of the WTO. Just two of those committees, they took up almost 850 specific trade concerns since 1995. So it's a very large proportion of the day-to-day problems that we see, and a large proportion of that has been resolved in these committees and in this dialogue. The private sector is very much involved in this process, so the views of small and large firms, all alike, are heard about the effects of the new standards and how they have an impact on their business. And things like this, they don't really catch the headlines of newspapers, but they are critically important to members. We also work very closely with a range of partner organizations. So it's not that we do this work alone and by ourselves. With the World Bank, for example, we have looked into the role of trading in eliminating poverty, in particular extreme poverty. And this led to a report which we launched a few months ago. I suggest that you take a look if you have the time and appetite. With UNEP, we have discussed how trade and environmental policies can go hand in hand. And we work closely with both the IMF and the World Bank constantly to deliver a more coherent and cohesive economic policy making. So this is just to mention a few of these activities that shows how this interinstitutional framework works well, particularly for the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, the continuous exchange of ideas is an integral part of our work, like I said. And as you know, some of those issues, and just from hearing what they are, you know that they can stir some very strong differences between members in the WTO. So when these difficult issues arise, and as I said, they certainly do, the organization provides a place for discussing them, and often with results which are mutually acceptable understandings. But if these understandings don't materialize, we offer a dispute settlement mechanism that has an outstanding track record on the international stage. So in just 20 years, we have successfully dealt with almost 500 disputes in 20 years. Just to give you an idea, in the 47 years of the GATT, 300 disputes were received. So more than double of that in less than half the time. So this is a phenomenal level of demand, and that has, of course, put pressure on the system. And we're dealing with that pressure, I think, with some success, but that's clearly not a problem that results from shortcomings. It is a problem that results from the success of the operation of the system, because members are using it more and more. So, also, the topics that are being handled in the dispute settlement mechanism show that the WTO is perfectly in tune with current issues. So a few of the recent disputes, I'll mention some of them, they touch upon, for example, the relationship between trade and renewable energy, or policies to discourage tobacco consumption, or packaging information for consumers, or even preservation and management of exhaustible resources. So all of these are critical issues, and they are on all the pages of the newspaper. They are being discussed in the context of the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, which means that the jurisprudence that we have on these issues is also evolving, and therefore new precedents are being set, and the rules of the organization somehow, even if indirectly, are also evolving. But of course, this does not solve everything. We need to evolve through negotiating new trade rules, and this is often where most of the focus is placed by the media, and it is an area where I at least believe we can deliver a lot more. Many argue that the difficulties in advancing the Doha round, the latest in a very long line of rounds, show that the organization lost its ability to negotiate. And while these difficulties are very real, the reality is that members are negotiating all the time. And actually, they have delivered a great deal. So on a regular basis at the General Council in Geneva, as well as at our ministerial conferences, members decide on very important matters in global trade. For example, every time that a member joins the WTO, it is the result of intense negotiations which require consensus for that member to join the WTO. But the clearest proof that the multilateral system can deliver new negotiated outcomes is our Bali ministerial, which happened a couple of years ago. So that was in 2013, and that package that was negotiated in Bali, it contains a set of decisions that includes steps on agriculture, measures for the least developed countries, and the first multilateral agreement since the WTO was created, which is the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And that was a very, very bold step. The Trade Facilitation Agreement will simplify and standardize global customs procedures, therefore speeding them up, which can lead to an average cut in trade costs by around 14%. An impact that is, and mind you, potentially greater than if we had eliminated all tariffs around the world. That's how important this agreement is. And while the economic gains of the agreement, or of the Bali package, are indeed significant, it has also a much broader systemic impact. So why? Because it demonstrated that the WTO can deliver negotiated outcomes and results when members find common ground and when there is a political will to do that. If there is no political will, then forget it. There's no amount of creativity that will bring it about. And actually, we have also delivered a number of other important agreements. We had a major breakthrough in July, I hope some of you noticed, when a group of WTO members laid the basis for the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement. So that was this last July. And this is the first tariff-cutting agreement in 18 years in the WTO. It's very important. It will eliminate tariffs of around 200 new tariff lines, which include things like GPS navigation systems, touch screens, iPhones, you know, better than I do all these products. So trade in all of them, these 200 new lines, is valued around $1.3 trillion every year. That's about 7% of world trade. So on top of that, while this expansion was agreed by only a set of members, the benefits, therefore, the tariff reductions apply to all WTO members, to all 161, based precisely on those principles that I mentioned of non-discrimination just a moment ago. So the agreement itself has a unique architecture. So it's a different kind of agreement. We say it's a new DNA, and that's very important. And that kind of DNA, I think, and I'm not going to get into that now, but it points the direction of the future agreements that I think we may have in the WTO. The importance of negotiating in the WTO is because if countries cannot negotiate there, they will negotiate somewhere else. The world's not going to stop. And I think that this is illustrated by the emergence of regional trade agreements and free trade agreements that we are seeing today. The WTO rules themselves are the basis of many of these agreements. However, those agreements may go beyond what the WTO has already negotiated, and that has implications for the future. So if you have a proliferation of different rules and different standards emerging from all these agreements, this could be a drag on business and not help business at the end of the day. So this is an important area of our work. But we should not also at the same time overstate this. These agreements have always coexisted with the WTO. They have always been negotiated. They prove to be reinforced, mutually reinforcing. And the rules and standards that have been negotiated outside the GATT and the WTO, they were subsequently somehow being incorporated into the WTO in a different shape. It's not a transposition, but somehow they are inspiring what we do in the WTO. Now, on top of that, the importance of negotiating multilaterally is that because there are some issues which you cannot negotiate outside. It's the case of agricultural subsidies, for example, or even fishery subsidies. You may have some agreements here and there, but it's never going to address the issue properly and fully like they would in the WTO. So we need really to put the spotlight back in the WTO, and we need to improve our capacity to negotiate faster. So today, we find ourselves tackling some pretty tough matters. The situation in Geneva is not very hard, not very positive, and we need to make an honest assessment of the situation today. Right now, we are working hard to deliver meaningful results in the Nairobi conference this December. It's the first time that we're going to have a ministerial conference in Africa. These conferences, as you know, they happen every 2 years. And they bring together all members to take important decisions on matters related to the agreements. Now, in the negotiations that we are conducting now, the gaps that we have between members in some of the critical issues are still very, very large. They have proved to be extremely contentious. The situation may change, but right now it doesn't really look like they will. So let's see what happens. We're still working. Before coming here, I was having meetings in another building just close to here. Didn't look very good, but despite these very big differences and these disagreements, I think that there is a potential for some meaningful outcomes in Nairobi. From the conversations that I have had recently, I think that deliverables are within reach. Members are now discussing what these deliverables could be and whether we can actually deliver them. I think that's the biggest question. What is important is that there is a broad understanding that whatever the deliverables are, the development component has to be present there. So how do we move forward now is up to the members. Looking at our negotiating prospects more broadly, I think that the history provides some important clues on how we can move forward. We have proven, like I said, that we can negotiate, particularly when we are open to take innovative approaches. So just think outside the box. So we should not lose sight of that. And to conclude, where does the WTO stand after 20 years? Now, I think the WTO was seen as a key pillar of a new kind of global economic order, which is open, inclusive, cooperative, that was taking shape at the end of the Cold War. And through very much hard work, I think that this vision has been made into a reality. So global trade barriers are historically low. The international trade has grown significantly. Trade today is underpinned by solid rules, and most importantly, rules that are respected. Participation in the trading system has become nearly universal, and support is being provided for the smallest and the poorest members that need that kind of support. Members are making use of the dispute settlement mechanism, and the body of trade law is developing with that. And more members are using the WTO councils, the committees, the working groups. They coordinate policies. They head off disputes using the soft power of the system, which complements, of course, the hard power of the dispute settlement mechanism. So the fact that we are seeing increased commitment and expanded cooperation resolving disputes through the WTO, even in periods of crisis and difficult economic growth like we have today, all that, I think, is the strongest testament to the system's success. I think if the WTO didn't exist, we would have to invent it or something very close to it. But managing this system is not simple. Advancing negotiations is still an institutional task for the organization. I have argued this evening that the WTO's contribution to the global economy to development is much broader than any round of negotiations. The multilateral system has come a long way, but the system accomplishments over the past two decades are not a guarantee that the system is going to continue to deliver in the future. So, in the end, the WTO represents the willingness of the members to cooperate. It represents the recognition that their national interests are increasingly intertwined with their collective interests. And the risk that we have today is that having created this open, rules-based, universal trading system, which the founders could only dream of, members now may take it for granted. I think that's the risk. This 20th anniversary year is shaping up to be a very critical one in our history. We say that a lot, actually. And we seek to build on the success of Bali to ensure that we continue to deliver and that we have a very successful ministerial conference in Nairobi in a few months' time. So if we want to deliver in Nairobi, members have to show their drive and commitment once again. I think they can do it. I really do. The WTO, I think, will continue to be an essential pillar for global economic governance. And I think that when we hand the system over to the next generation, the system will be stronger and more vibrant than ever. I'm pretty confident of that. So these are just initial thoughts. If you have any questions and if you have any interest in covering a little bit more in depth anything that I have said or that I have not said, more than open to try. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Director General, for this very dense and very interesting overview of your organization at 20 years. There is a bit of time for a few questions. Please introduce yourself and keep your question short and to the point, please. Who wants to start?
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Azevêdo. My name is Alexandre from Brazil, as you are. Well, thank you very much for your words. To be honest, I don't know if you answer my question, but if possible, could you assess the impact of a possible transatlantic trade agreement upon the WTO agenda? Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Could you assess the impact of a potential transatlantic trade agreement upon the WTO agenda? Thank you.
Should I take a few more questions, then I'll try to go on? Yeah.
Okay. Maybe over there.
Thank you and happy 20th anniversary. I'm Jane Hodges, a research associate with UNRIST based here in Geneva. And taking my question quite internally, and you're stressing the day-to-day work here at the headquarters in particular. Just how many women and men work in the organisation? Do you have a gender equality policy amongst your staff? Hearing that the Graduate Institute is obviously making some interesting moves in that direction.
How many people work there?
How many women versus men work, particularly in the upper grades of the WTO? Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question regarding the policy of WTO. As we know, decisions in WTO are taken only if every country agree upon it. But on the other hand, it also makes the procedure of negotiating a bit more difficult. So what are the measures which are to be taken for WTO to make the procedure of negotiation easier? Maybe to put the countries in the group which share the same interest in order to make the procedure easier. Thank you.
The procedure in the negotiations?
Yeah, during the negotiation rounds. I mean, every country.
Results.
Yeah, I mean, every country has to agree whether the decision to be taken. But probably it's possible to put country in the groups which share the same interest, so the group can take a decision. Thank you.
I am Cornelio Sommaruga, former State Secretary of Switzerland for Foreign Trade. This was 30 years ago. But at that time, I had to negotiate a lot free trade agreements and always come to the GATT as organization, in quotation mark, to defend, according to Article 24, these free trade agreements that were a sort of exception of the most favored nation clause. Now, seeing the development of free trade agreements, mostly bilateral ones across the world, I wonder, and that is probably also the first question that goes in this direction, if you have not the erosion of the principles of Article 24, and how can you defend the general agreement inside the WTO.
Let's take a last one, maybe, over there at the back.
Hi, my name's Alexandra. I'm from Australia.
Where are you, Alexandra?
Stand. Okay.
Where? Oh, hi.
Hi. I have a very specific question about the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. I'm just wondering, what is your personal opinion on the precautionary principle in relation to genetically modified organisms?
On the proportion of?
Precautionary principle.
Oh,
in
boy.
relation to GMOs.
Okay.
The last one over there.
Thank you very much. Leonila Guglia, PhD candidate, University of Geneva. I have a question in regard to this new DNA of the trade agreements that you have mentioned earlier in your speech today. And my question basically is single undertaking still on the agenda, or it's being replaced, or how it's going to be interacting with this new DNA and how they're going to be working together? Thank you very much.
Compared to the agreements that are ongoing outside the WTO.
How do you see the developments of single undertaking strategy that was at stake and still, I believe, is at stake as the core of the legal structure of the WTO in future? How these new agreements are going to be integrating within or interplaying with that?
Okay. So, pretty ambitious agenda here. I'll try my best to summarize my answers here. Good news for the ladies, we have more women than men in the WTO. So we have 354 ladies, women, 322 men. So we are a minority now. That's good news for me as well. So anyway, that answers at least one of the questions. On TTIP's impact on the WTO, it's a little bit what I said before, and that goes a little bit also to the question about Article 24, because it's clearly going to have a market access element there, and I think that is something that maybe I should start with. When you see these agreements being negotiated outside the WTO, and I think, to be fair, there is a distinction between the most recent types of agreement that you're seeing in two senses. First, the size of the economies that are negotiating them, and second, the content of what is being negotiated. So traditionally, and like I said, the WTO coexisted and the GATT coexisted with many agreements that were negotiated outside their structures. But those agreements, in general, mostly had to do with tariffs and market access. Now, that is something that Article 24 deals with directly, right? The problem is not that, because that, I think we have already the structure to do that. The problem, I think, is when you're negotiating outside the WTO, rules, standards, disciplines, which go beyond what the WTO has for a particular issue, or which touch issues that are not covered by the WTO. That, I think, is the most interesting field to study. And I actually got the economists in the WTO, and I saw some of them when I was coming in, and they are supposed to be working precisely on that, aren't they? They are. Yeah, so that is something that we need to do. We have to look a little bit more about this new generation of agreements in the rule-making area. The problem we have is twofold. One is these negotiations are confidential. So we don't have access to everything that is being negotiated there. So we don't really know. We read in the press and we talk, we listen, but it's different when you see it on paper. That is a problem. The second problem we see there is that many of those agreements, they tend to just refer to WTO. I mean, often, what they do is we have new disciplines in anti-dumping or in safeguards, but when you really read, they're remitting it to the WTO. They're saying, well, as far as anti-dumping is concerned, we apply the principle, and then they send it back to the WTO. So we have to really see how much more is there. Because a lot of the problems that we had in negotiations in the WTO are not because of the number of members that are there. And some people say, you have 161, how can you negotiate among 161 members? But the problem is not the numbers. If we were just 6, we'd still be in the same position. If we were 5, we'd still be in the same position. If you, actually, depending on the 2, if you were just 2, you would still be stuck. So it's not about the number. It's about the differences, the main differences that exist between core players. And many of the issues that bogged us down in the WTO over the years were among those players who are now negotiating outside the WTO. So if they find a solution there for some of those big issues, very contentious issues, very polemic issues, great, because they will inspire, and maybe at that point in time, negotiations in the WTO will become easier in many of those issues. So there is a potential, I think, for these agreements outside the WTO, and the question on TTIP, I think, also applies to TPP and some other initiatives that are going on out there. They may even help the negotiations in Geneva, depending on what is negotiated, and that's to be seen. I don't know. Let's see what it is, and then I'll tell you. Because another possibility is that you have conflicts among the initiatives, that you have different disciplines applying, and between what they agree and what is already in the WTO. Because, members interpret WTO rules in different ways. So they may do something that conflicts, but in their view, it is compatible. With the view of others, in the view of others, it may be a conflicting disposition. So all that, I think we need more clarity at the end of the day. We have to see the agreements, read them, see exactly what was negotiated before we can say, this is a good thing or this is something that will be a problem. I don't know. Let's wait and see. It's premature to say. But like I said, we cannot overstate the problem, saying that these things are problematic because they're being negotiated elsewhere. We cannot also understate and say this is not a problem, never going to be a problem. No, there could be a problem, or there could not. We have to see what comes out of that. That's my take for this point, at this point, on these agreements. I think they hold potential to help, especially market access. The more the countries liberalize their tariffs amongst themselves, the easier it is to have a future multilateral negotiation. They already have made the concessions that they needed to make. Let me move a little bit now to, I think there was a question about organizing the groups and how that could help, I think, in the negotiations, separating the groups thematically. That already does happen. They organize themselves among what they call themselves like-minded countries. So they have similar interests. They organize themselves. So we have the G33, the G20, the Cairns group, the G11, the NUM 11, the G10. There are a number of groups, each one of them organized in different structures, different geography. Some are geographic, so you have the African group. Some are in terms of sizes of the economies, the LDCs, for example, the least developed countries, or the ACP, the African, Caribbean, Pacific. They organize themselves all over the place. The problem is not having an agreement within those groups. The problem is having the agreement between different groups. Because the moment that you have a group organizing and saying that this is red, there is another one organizing saying that this is blue. And then that's where the problem begins to have. But they do help. I think the groups do help because they particularly they give voice to countries that otherwise wouldn't have because they're small. But when they organize themselves in a group, it makes it more easy. The possibility of having an agreement within a group and reaching the decision within a group is also what we call a plurilateral. And we have that. I just mentioned now the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement. It is a group of countries that have gotten together to eliminate tariffs on 200 information technology products. To the extent that they can come to an agreement, like they did, as long as whatever they agree is available to everybody else, that's a possibility too. So we have those two kinds of interactions there in the group dynamics. On the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle, you will recall, emerged from environmental discussions. That's where it started, particularly in the examination of exhaustible resources, climate, where you would take action to avoid that something worse would come without necessarily having to wait for the consequences of that before you took the action. So that was the idea of the precautionary principle in the environmental discussion. There was a conversation in the WTO about the precautionary principle also, particularly, if I'm not mistaken, in agriculture. I think it started in agriculture. The EU, I think, had a big part in that conversation, where members, according to proposals that were made there, a member could impose certain types of restrictions or prudential measures, even before one could definitively prove that a product or a formulation would be affecting, say, health, animal health or human health. But it did not go very far. I think members are still struggling with this. We do have these principles of scientific-based evidence. How far do we go? You have to notify. You have international standards which are put in place by international organizations like the OIE, which can be a reference for that. So we have a number of other elements that come into play when you begin to talk about the precautionary principle. But there has been, so far, no uniform view about the importation of the precautionary principle as it was originally formulated into the trade agreements. That, I think, is still a conversation that is ongoing. Gabrielle is here. Am I saying something stupid? No? I'm fine? Okay. So I got approval here. So that's what I think the precautionary principle is at this point in time. One last question here was the single undertaking in the future, whether it is something that can be there for the future negotiations, even in importing, I think, things that are being negotiated outside. The single undertaking, if you want to have a conversation about that, you have to be clear about what you mean by single undertaking, all right? Because some people confuse it, and I have read it in the press and sometimes even in academic papers, an interpretation of the single undertaking, which is not really the correct technical interpretation of the single undertaking. What is the single undertaking? The single undertaking is an endeavor where you have a number of issues that have been put on the table. You're negotiating, let's say, 10 issues. And I myself am very interested in some of them, not all, but some of them I'm very interested. And somebody is asking me to make a concession in item number 3. And I say, well, no, I'm not going to negotiate item number 3 until I know what happens in item number 5, because I'm not going to make any concessions here until number 5 is agreed, because I'm very, very keen on what's going to happen in number 5. So what has been agreed is the single undertaking, which gives flexibility for me to say, okay, I will agree with item 3 on the things that are here, but with the understanding that this is not agreed. This is only agreed when everything has been agreed, because then I have to make sure that I have my say in item 5. If item 5 is not negotiated to my satisfaction, I can go back to item 3 and say, what I put on the table here, forget it, it's off. That was the concept of the single undertaking. That was done to avoid the situation of hostage taking, where you would never negotiate anything because you would have to have exact parallel movements in all the areas of negotiations. So people created the single undertaking, which was supposed to help the negotiations by allowing the negotiators to make movements contingent on what happened in the other areas. This concept, I think, sometimes has been interpreted as you need outcomes in all 10 areas, otherwise the negotiations are never concluded. But there may be situations when you say, well, we put 10 on the table to start with, but these 3 here, they don't work. So let's take those 3 out, we conclude these other 7, and then we're done with it. As long as there is consensus and everybody agrees with that, you can conclude the endeavor with just 7 areas instead of 10. So the single undertaking is being misread somehow to mean that once you put something on the table, it is always on the table, and it will be forever on the table, and create that kind of expectation. It's not so. It is so from a political perspective. Once you put something there, you need consensus to take it out. But there is no written rule that the single undertaking is about once you put something, it can never come out. You know why? Because then the consequence of that is that you're going to have a hell of a fight just to put something there, because the others will say, well, once it's in, it's never out. Then I'm going to negotiate that to the last cent, and it's never going to work. So we have to go back with the single undertaking to the original principles. Now, to answer your question even more objectively, the single undertaking meaning a large number of issues, like in the context of a round or something like that, it may be possible to continue and to have it. We clearly have one on the table now, the Doha Development Agenda. We will have more in the future, possibly. It's difficult to tell. I don't know. This has taken now 14 years. Now, is it because of the size? I don't think so. I think if you had just 1 or 2 issues, you would still be stuck. So it's not about the size of the negotiation. I think it's about the size of the gaps on the expectations of the core members on what happens in 1 or 2 issues. 1 or 2. And then you get everything stuck. Now, is it that in the future we're going to do things differently? Maybe. Can we do it independently? Do we need a single undertaking to get things done, to get agreements? Not always. We just had, for example, the trade facilitation agreement. It was outside the single undertaking. We had the information technology agreement now. It's a plurilateral, but it's outside the single undertaking. There were no needs for intersectoral trade-offs. So there are many ways that we can do things in the WTO. I think if at the end of the day people feel that another single undertaking is useful, they will go for it. If they think it's not useful, they won't. I'll tell you one funny fact. Funny fact in the WTO is not abundant. When the WTO was created, the idea was not to have rounds anymore. That was the idea. The idea was to have a structure with committees, subcommittees, and things like that, where you would negotiate in the committees. So it would be very specialized, very technical, and any negotiation that had to happen on that issue, it would take place in the committee in the WTO. The idea was not to have a round until somebody came with the idea of a round. Just before 2000, the Millennium Round, it was supposed to be called. And then, because members talked and they found some trade-offs, they decided to go along. Okay, so let's have another round. But that was not the idea. The idea originally was that you would create an institution that would not make the rounds necessary any longer. You could have very specific technical negotiations. It's clearly, I was not there when it was finalized in 1995, the WTO. But I read some stuff, and unless people were not accurate in what they were writing, that was one of the ideas, was to get rid of the big rounds and do technical, localized, topical work throughout. So that exhausts my list of questions, and also, unfortunately, exhausts my time. Let me tell you that I really enjoy this kind of conversation. It doesn't happen often enough, but I try to answer to the best of my abilities. The WTO is very open, so if you want to pursue this, if you have any specific interest that you would like to explore further in the context of your work or just intellectual interest, I don't know, please reach out to the Secretariat. I have directly instructed them to be as forthcoming as possible to anyone that approaches asking for information, transparency. It is an organization that I think has been perceived for too long as a black box, and also as a club of big countries defending multinationals and things like that. Look, I think it's way beyond the time that we correct that image, because it doesn't reflect the truth. So if you do have an interest, please reach out, and we'll be as transparent as we can to give you all the information that you need. So that's an invitation to continue this conversation. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Well, let me just express our many thanks to you for sharing with us today your views and on the workings and challenges of your organization. You have a standing invitation, this place, so we are looking forward to welcome you again here. Thank you.